Hey everyone, Tori here with Cedar Hill Homestead to do a little plant walk. I am in our local game reserve where they're doing lots of logging, so I'm really trying to get out here as much as possible to enjoy this plant life before it's taken away. I'm also doing my best to transplant some that won't take over that we use a lot, and so I'm going to take this opportunity to show you all around. All the plants that I'm going to show you for the next little bit of time, I'm not sure exactly how long it'll be, are all literally within a half-mile radius of each other. So really incredibly rich area, although we've got this really dense clay-like soil here. But that's how a lot of these medicinal herbs roll. They do wonderfully in disturbed areas. And the first one we're going to talk about is especially notorious for that, and it is mullein. This is a really nice sized mullein right here. It's definitely working on getting its stalk up. You can see where it's starting to form the flower buds and stalk that will shoot up. We've got all these big beautiful leaves down here, and I definitely want to talk about harvesting techniques because I know that that's going to come up. But just to go over the properties of this beautiful plant real quick. Mullein is for sure most noted for its help in respiratory health. It is a wonderful ally for all things respiratory. It's really going to be great whether you have a dry cough or a boggy cough, because it's pretty neutral in energetics. I would say if anything it's more so on the cooling, moistening side, but it's not over moistening or cooling, so you don't have to worry too much about that. Really great in teas or tinctured. There's all sorts of things you can do with this beautiful plant. I enjoy it most commonly in tinctures, but I always keep some on hand for teas because when Augustine gets sick, that's really the best way. His system responds really well to teas. So mullein has a couple different uses actually. This is one of those plants where the roots have a use, the leaves have a use, and the stalks have a use, or the flowers, I'm sorry. So there's actually more research being done about the roots right now, but we know from a few herbalists and their experiences that people are able to use the roots for specifically sciatica and back nerve pain. I have collected the roots and am tincturing them for the first time, so I'm going to start trying that out soon, and I will certainly be taking notes on my experience with it. But I've read from a lot of people that they've had a really good experience with it, so I'm excited to try. So these can be found all over the place. You should not necessarily harvest them all over the place. For example, I see these a lot near train tracks, but these big beautiful plants that grow in these disturbed oils, they're really good at absorbing those pollutants. So you want to be careful. Make sure you're at least 50 feet away from the road, and really it should be more than that. So just keep that in mind. Also, you got to wonder like how busy the area you're in is, how high of traffic. So this plant just recently shot up this big stalk. Before now, the stalk middle part was not here. There was just these bottom few layers of leaves. And so how I was harvesting at that point was I was just taking the very bottom leaves to encourage it to continue sending upward. And that's actually still what I'm going to do right now. I would be taking from these bottom leaves more so as a way to be courteous. So if you were in a situation like me where you know these are going to get demolished within a couple weeks, I would take some of the younger leaves as well, because that's where the most potent medicine is going to be. We know, because I talk about it a lot, that the most concentration of the plant's medicine is going to be in the part where it's focusing on growing. So right now with this plant focusing on pushing this stalk and this flower up, the concentration of the medicine is going to be most prevalent there. Now once this shoots up a stalk, in about a month it'll get these precious little yellow flowers, and that is what we see used in ear oils for ear infection. It's important that you know that it is not just mullein that's being used for the ear infections. It is very specifically just those little yellow flowers. So keep that in mind. I think that a common mistake when people first come into herbalism is two things. One, you hear a genus of a plant. So for example, Vervain, we've got blue Vervain, we've got Vervain officinalis, we've got white Vervain, and they do not all have the same uses. Another common thing that I see a lot is people hear that a plant is good for something and they don't necessarily look into which part of the plant is good for something. So always keep that in mind. So I actually found something I'm really excited that I get to transplant home, and that is wild caraway. Look at this beautiful plant. It's got these really soft, sort of dill-like leaves, and you can really point out some of these more wild spices that way. For example, wild dog fennel has very similar leaves. So if I didn't know what this plant is, I might notice those first. I might come up, take a whiff, and go, wow, that smells like a cross between anise and caraway. And then I could further investigate. And here, you can see on its little flower pods where those seeds are forming that we eat and cook with. So this is really exciting. I'm definitely going to harvest this guy and transplant the roots to my home so we can use this delicious wild spice. I don't actually know of many medicinal uses of caraway. That is just a food plant for us, but it is a tasty and exciting one nonetheless. So there's definitely a whole lot of boneset and goldenrod leaves coming up. We will not see the flowers of boneset or goldenrod for quite some time, but luckily we can use the leaves now for medicinal preparations. Here we go. So this here is the young goldenrod that's just beginning to pop out. It'll be around for quite some time before it starts flowering. And this does get a little pink on the stems, but not nearly as much. It's not going to be that red color. And mostly the stems are going to appear green. These leaves, although they're a pretty common leaf shape, when you're familiar with goldenrod, you'll start to notice how they're kind of lanky. They're long and slender, and they just kind of droop. They're not quite as erect as some other leaves are. So it's harder to point these plants out before they're flowering, but it's a good thing to know, and I have faith that you guys can figure it out, especially if you've seen goldenrod in an area in the fall. If you go back to that same area now, it probably won't be very hard for you to find it. So what we can do to start getting the lovely benefits of goldenrod now is to take the leaves and incorporate them into teas or tinctures to help detox the body, so to help rid us of bacteria, urinary tract infections. It does have a particular affinity for the urinary tract as well as the respiratory system. Goldenrod is really, really important for drying up. It's an expectorant, but what its main properties are is an astringent. And so we know astringents are really good at tightening and toning. And typically when we see respiratory astringent herbs, they're also going to be drying. And so this can be an issue with the urinary tract infections. You just don't want to take too much of it when you have a urinary tract infection. I've only known one person of all the people who I have helped through reoccurring urinary tract infections by using raspberry leaf and goldenrod, which are both some strong astringent herbs, who has taken too much and felt like she was a little backed up. But for the most part, it's really fast acting, so you don't have to take it very long anyways. It's also incredible for drying up allergies. And that's what we're really going to use it for right now, is taking these leaves and either making a tea or tincturing or even putting them in vinegar to help dry up those allergies. Like allergies, we think about just running, right? Lots of loose fluids coming out of the body. So we want those astringent drying herbs, and goldenrod is really a major player in that arena. Now, another one that we've been over, but it wasn't quite this big, that I would also use if you have it nearby for these exact things, is the Pennsylvania Everlasting. So this is in the everlasting family. There's quite a few of these plants. If you are further west, you probably have pearly everlasting. Here in the south, we have Pussy Toes Everlasting and Pennsylvania Everlasting, and this grows up to the northeast. So it's in bloom right now. It's got these weird papery flowers similar to Pearly Everlasting. There's a lot of it. I'm really excited to harvest this. It's pretty easy to spot out any of the plants in the Everlasting family because they have this really silvery, ashy tone to them that we don't see in many other plants. We see it in the back of mugwort, sometimes juniper. So this is a really, really cool plant. I know I talk about it a lot, but we need to talk about it more because there's not a lot of information published about this beautiful plant. Pearly Everlasting, however, there is, but this is what we see commonly in herbalism, where one plant from a genus is really idolized. Farmers are growing it. You can find it on Mountain Rose Herbs and Star West Botanicals, but that doesn't mean that the other plants in that family are not as good. It just means, you know, like it would be ridiculous if we sold a plant from every genus that have the same uses. So some of them are easier to grow, and that's typically where those come from. But that's the beauty of knowing the plants around you, is you likely have some of the same plants that are popular in herbalism with a different name, and maybe they look a little different, but they do the same thing. So that's why I love to talk about these two plants. They're just really good at what they do as well. We can tell by the ashy color and those papery dry flowers that this is an incredibly drying plant. So this is something that we are specifically going to want to use for wet, boggy coughs, as well as drying up those drippy, nasally, allergy type things. Pussy Toes Everlasting was called women's tobacco by the Cherokee, so it can also be smoked or inhaled for those same reasons, which this is something else I try to talk about a lot. Although it seems counterintuitive to smoke herbs for a respiratory infection or illness, it's actually quite nice because you have those wide open blood capillaries in your lungs, so you're able to directly deliver that medicine, which is pretty incredible. So here's another one of my favorites. They're all my favorites, right? But seriously, I know you guys hear me talk about this one a lot too, is mountain mint. And it is young right now. It's in its teenage phase, so it looks a little different than it will when it's fully formed. But this is another ashy plant. You can see the silvery undersides, the silver on the stalks. It's a little bit fuzzier than other mints. It's got like a really soft, fuzzy stem, not so much rough, coarse hairs like nettle. And I just am in awe of this plant. It's one of my favorite flavors. It's one of my favorite scents. It's just unique and beautiful and different. I remember when I first started using it in one of our teas in place of mint, regular grown mint, everyone was like, wow, what is in this tea? It's so delicious. It's so different tasting. And that's what it was. It was the mountain mint as opposed to garden mint. It's got a really unique flavor. It's just totally different. I absolutely love it. So I talked about this in the last video. So if this interests you at all, I would encourage you to go back to that. Mint family plants have a lot in common. Whether you find wild water mint, wild wood mint, wild mountain mint, wild mint, they're all going to have some things in common, and that's that they're bitter herbs. So by knowing what their action is, we can start to assume what their uses are. So these being bitter herbs, they are going to activate the mucosa. That's something else I talked more about in the last video. And by activating the mucosa, we know it's going to do two things for sure. It's going to aid in digestion, and it is going to help with respiratory issues. So that is why we inhale the steam of mint, eucalyptus, all those really volatile oil-rich plants when we're sick. They help to break up mucus, loosen the phlegm, and those same actions are going to be really wonderful for digestion too. So mints are incredible to include in things that you want. Oh, beautiful butterfly. Anything that you're using for either of those two things. It's also, mints are typically mildly sedating. So it's in our Rest in Peace blend for that reason. And mint family is one that you should absolutely learn because they grow everywhere and they're pretty easy to spot out. They've got that square stem, and they've also got these leaves that grow right across from each other over and over again. Again, this is a situation where if you think you've got it but you're not sure, what can you do? Smell it! If you're still not sure, because maybe it's young, maybe it's got too much sun, so the smell isn't scent, what else can you do? Taste it. And if you're nervous about tasting it, spit it out. I thought I found another wild mint, but I don't think I did. All right, who else can we highlight today? I know I've got some big thistles right behind me. So another common misconception with people coming into herbalism is that all thistle is milk thistle. I don't know why, but I hear that one a lot. There are hundreds of types of thistles in the world, and only one of them is milk thistle. They are all edible, which is really nice. If you are in Europe, Asia, and you are stuck and you need to eat a survival food, you can eat thistles. They're everywhere. So are they easy to eat? No. You better have a knife to peel those thick thistles back. They're really like daggers. But inside of there is a really nice, light, crispy... It's compared to a celery a lot. It doesn't actually taste quite like celery or cucumber, but it's very similar in that it's light in flavor, it's crispy, it's soft, and there is a lot of it once you peel those leaves back. Now, the most common thistle that we have in my area is called bull thistle, and bull thistle is really wonderful for, hold on, spotted a cool plant. Oh, milkweed! Bull thistle is really nice for cooling inflammation in the joints. There was a study done about rheumatoid arthritis with bull thistle, and the results were incredibly impressive. I do think this is a plant that hasn't gotten a lot of attention up until now, but I think it will soon after those studies because they're pretty impressive. So I tincture this, I save the leaves for teas, and it is in a blend that I offer to consultation clients for arthritis and any sort of pain where we need cooling herbs instead of those classic warming ones like turmeric and black pepper. So I'm going to show you real quick this cute little milkweed because I can't not. I love the blooms on milkweeds. They're so gorgeous. So this is another latex plant like wild lettuce. So you can see after I crack the leaves that there's that latex right there. I don't want to talk too much about milkweed because I don't use milkweed. I believe that its herbal uses and its edible uses are more of a survival type thing. There are plenty of other plants that are safer to use that do what it does. However, if you are out and about and you think you've got like a fungal infection or ringworm, that sap is really great topical for that type of thing. There are edible parts to it, the little shoots that come up, which we're a little late on now, and it's pods, it's seed pods when they first come out. So if that interests you at all, you can do a little more research on that, but we just choose not to use it. Okay, where was I going next? I mean, I should probably show you all this beautiful wild lettuce that's about to bloom, even though I did a full video on it. It's just so gorgeous. Oh, that was it, white vervain. I'm right here surrounded by white vervain, so I'll show you that after this. So, right here is a massive wild lettuce. I would love to show you the top of it, where it's getting ready to floret out. Whoop. Look at all that latex just oozing out, asking to be used. I'll use you. So I didn't talk too much about identifying it in my last video, so I will show you that. Up close you can see it's also got a dark splotchy stem. It's got these sharp leaves that look very similar to dandelion when they're young and first growing up, but wild lettuce leaves are much more defined. They've got a very strong vertebrae on the back, and you can even see the red splotchiness on the vein of the leaf. Incredible plant. I highly encourage everyone to go watch my video on this plant because its uses are pretty irreplaceable. Let's see, oh, is that you, white vervain? Yes, it is. All right, so most of you have probably heard of blue vervain. This is white vervain. It has not quite started flowering yet, but right here is where these little teeny tiny white flowers will start to pop up. And this growth pattern is very common for vervains. So it's got the similar leaf style as the mint family, but it sends out its flowers where it leaves, which is so interesting. So if you can get familiar with this shape, you will be able to point out vervains when you see them. So white vervain has different uses. I just saw a flowering one, so I get to show you that. Teeny flowers. I mean, absolutely teeny, but precious. So white vervain is not used in the same way as blue vervain, unfortunately, because we have tons of it and I love blue vervain. Whoops. But it does have some cool uses. Mostly what I've seen, some traditional Cherokee uses are of the roots. And again, it's just kind of like some of the uses that it has are more easily found elsewhere. But if you have a lot of it and you want to use it up, you certainly can. It is a diuretic, so it's going to be really nice for supporting our detoxification systems in the body. I just found another pretty big patch of it. This is all it right here. You can definitely, I have heard that it has some mild sedative effects similar to blue vervain. So if you just wanted to use it, it does also have very bitter properties, which are great for digestion and detoxing. You could use the leaves in teas, and if you really needed a strong detox, you could, boil down the roots and use those too. Okay, definitely want to talk about ragweed. We'll get there. All right. I'll talk about you, Poke. Poke wants us to listen this year. So, here is my friend Poke. Poke is a very strong plant. You can see the berries are getting ready to form. Most of you have probably heard about poke salad. So Poke has got very defined... Well, I'm going to do something a little interesting. I hate when this happens, but my phone's going to die. So I'm going to show you these plants, and then I'm going to talk about them in the car. So I'm going to show you Poke, because I'm not quite sure where the video cut off. This here is Poke. It's got big, broad leaves. These will turn into bright red berries. It's got a nice red stalk. And I'm also going to show you ragweed. Here's a good one. So this here is ragweed. Some people say it looks similar to mugwort, but it does not have a silvery underside. There's a few different types of ragweed. This is common ragweed, and there's another variety called tall ragweed, or large or giant ragweed. They can be used in the same exact way. They do look very different though. The giant ragweed is compared often to the same leaf shape as passion flower. So more of a like sassafras and passion flower kind of deal. And then we've got our common ragweed here. Now, ragweed certainly is responsible for allergies. There's no denying that. A lot of people are highly, highly, highly allergic to ragweed pollen. But, hold on, gotta plug me in here. She's got some very redeeming qualities because although she causes lots of allergies, she also helps with allergies. So what we commonly see together, I mentioned that I would use Goldenrod and maybe even some Everlasting if you have some near you in an allergy formula. Well, you can also throw Ragweed in that formula. A lot of people are using vinegars because we've been in the habit of making spring vinegars. They're really easy. Some plants extract better with the acidity of vinegar, and it's easier to incorporate into foods and taking it daily in an oxymel or what have you. So you could do any of those preparations. You could make a tea from it. Ragwort does also have some topical uses that I'm less familiar with because I've never used it in that way. But I do know that similar to plantain, you can make a poultice by expressing the oils from the leaves and sticking it directly on bug bites or stings or even burns, and it will apparently help soothe and relieve the burning and itching from the bite or the sting. Next up is Shiso. I love this plant. This is another invasive that I'm never upset about. It absolutely takes over part of our yard and driveway this time of year, and we use it as much as it pops up. So we have no problem at all with it. Shiso is in the mint family, so we can see that pretty clearly by the leaf pattern, as well as the very prominent square stems. You can not only feel the squareness of the stem, but you can visibly see it because they're just very prominent. Actually, everything about this plant is pretty well defined. The dips, the veins in the leaves, the edges of the leaves, the colors, the stems. It's a really beautiful plant, and you can see it starts to get a purple sheen on the underside. And as it matures, we'll see some of that red and purple color take over the tops as well. And actually in other parts of Tennessee, I see a lot of wild Shiso that is more purple than it is green. So keep that in mind. A lot of farmers around here too will grow the red Shiso, more typically than green, not so much because the difference in flavor, but because of the vitamin and mineral content. This is certainly up there with kale in the superfood context. It's incredibly rich in calcium, magnesium, potassium, and several different vitamins as well. It's got a beautiful scent and flavor. The scent and flavor are so different than the other mint family plants. It's very, very anise-like, but it's also got a bit of a spice to it too, like a anise, cinnamon, mint. It's hard to explain. So that being said, it goes really well with a lot of interesting things that you might not imagine. A lot of people call this plant beefsteak plant. So if you've ever heard that term before, that is in regards to this plant, Shiso. And a lot of people eat it with beef. Now, traditionally, this plant is eaten with sushi and sashimi, and is what originally gave pickled ginger that we see on sushi plates that pink color. Now that pink color is often more times dyed to achieve that same look that we've just gotten used to over the years. But traditionally in Japan, it was used to pickle ginger because of the effects, which we'll get to shortly. But it's really wonderful for digestion, stimulating those digestive juices. And so it's a really great thing to eat with red meats, really heavy meals. And it was actually paired with raw seafood because it's got some potent antibacterial effects as well, which was believed to help, kill off any bacterias that might be on the raw seafood. So lots of cool plants that make this a wonderful edible, lots of cool effects that make this plant a wonderful edible and medicinal. I'm definitely going to post a recipe for you all that we love. We actually use it in a couple different ways. Sometimes we will just chop it up and throw it in our kimchi or some other fermented foods, but you can actually ferment it just on its own and use it sort of like a relish on things, and it's really, really good. We personally ferment it very spicy with gochujang and a bit of shrimp paste, but you don't have to do all that. You can just lightly ferment it with salt. It's a really, really incredibly special flavor that you just won't find anywhere else. Similar to spice bush, there's just a few of those things out there that can't really be compared to other things. So I highly encourage you to get out and find shiso. This is one that I would say, if you think you have it in your area but you're not positive, smell it. And if it smells like it might be it, taste it. It is very different than mint. So if you were to smell it, you might get some mint and be like, it smells kind of like mint, but I'm not positive. It might be shiso. Look for the purpley color on the underneath, or red, and then give it a little nibble. You'll be surprised. Now, the medicinal actions of shiso are amazing. So I know I talk a lot about bitter herbs, bitter plants, but with good reason. The digestive process in our body is quite possibly one of the most important processes because it affects so many other systems of the body. It's also one of the largest organs of the body. So digestion is a really beautiful process that begins when we smell food. That starts to literally stimulate the saliva glands, which is why in old comics and cartoons, when there's delicious food, the dogs are drooling and people are salivating. That's what's literally happening when you smell a delicious meal that's preparing your body for the digestive process. Now, once you begin to taste food and taste particularly bitter herbs, you're then activating the saliva, the mucosa, which is helping to break down the foods that you're chewing to help your body better utilize them, turn them into fuel, and digest them. So bitter herbs are incredibly important to incorporate into the diet. There's a supplement company out there, Ancestral Supplements, that has a slogan, putting in what the modern world takes out. I feel that way every time I think about bitter herbs and taking a bitters, because our foods used to naturally be bitter. Things like lettuces, radishes, carrots, cucumbers even, things that we buy at the grocery store that are very mild in flavor were not always that mild in flavor. They were much different naturally, and we have modified them to be less bitter and more palatable to accommodate the desires of civilization now. But it was not always that way. So it's very important that if you're not incorporating bitter plants, herbs, and vegetables into your diet, that you replace that with taking a bitters before or after a meal. It's really best to take them before. What you take after a meal is called a digestif instead of an aperitif, but it's very similar herbs, and it's still going to help your body to break down that digestive process. This plant is also really, really great for specifically nausea, so it would be a good one to have on hand for post meals too, when some people can get a little overwhelmed and nauseous. But you can take it for other types of nausea as well, like motion sickness, anything that causes nausea. So that's why it was in pickled ginger for sushi, is not only to get that antibacterial properties, but to help with digesting the meal. I think a lot of traditional garnishes on plates and foods, we never really think about having a purpose, but more times than not, they once did. This plant is being studied for quite a few other things as well. It has been proven to have anti-allergen effects. So if you're making an allergy remedy at home right now, we've got some good candidates. Nettle, shiso, goldenrod leaves, and ragweed are all out right now, this would be a great thing to add. It's been researched and the studies have shown that to be true. It's also been shown to have strong anti-inflammatory properties as well. So that's going to be really nice for relieving some sinus pressure and things that come along with allergies. Now, one thing that I saw has been studied recently with Shiso that I have zero experience with, so I won't talk too much about, is making a Shiso extract for topical uses of dermatitis. So very interesting, complex little plant. You likely have some growing near you, and I would highly suggest that you enjoy it as food or just as a medicinal herb. This next plant I am so excited to show you all for so many reasons, but one being, I had been calling this plant in for such a long time before I finally found it in the wild a couple years ago in North Carolina. And it was one of those moments where I had kind of just come to terms that maybe there wasn't a variety that grew wild in my region. And so I wasn't expecting to stumble across it. So when I saw it peeking out amongst things much bigger than it, and I reached out and pinched one of those little yellow blooms in my hand and saw the beautiful vivid red purple come out on my fingers, I could have cried. And that flower was dwarf St. John's wort, or small flowered St. John's wort. This plant is so incredibly special. This is just one variety of the medicinal St. John's worts, Mullein, that, come on boy, you gotta move just a little, all the way down, stay. Someone else is very happy about it. That contain the hypericin content, which is what creates that red blood that comes out on your fingers when you pinch the blooms. Another one that's pretty common, not so much in my area, but maybe yours, is perforated St. John's wort. And that's really the classic one that we see used medicinally and sold in stores. And that's how you can tell if you have perforated St. John's wort is you pinch one of these leaves off and you hold it up to the sun, and if you can see little holes that let the sun in it, you've got perforated St. John's wort. Now, this plant has a lot of lookalikes. Actually, I see one right in front of me. Augustine knows what this plant looks like really well now because suddenly, and I'm telling you what, we have lived on this property, Olin, for several years now, and we had never found St. John's wort on it, and this is on our driveway, all over our property, everywhere. Suddenly it's everywhere, and we call that a plant-a-fest. We totally plant-a-fested that. So even though he's familiar with how this looks, he still gets it a little confused. And the part that's confusing is this leaf shape all the way up. Take a good look at this, and then I'll show you what he always confuses for St. John's wort. Lespedeza. Now, if you're not super familiar with either one, I can see how this would be tricky, but if you are familiar with one or the other, not so much. St. John's wort leaves have a really special growth pattern, so take a look at this up close. See how they just kind of take turns bursting out, alternating? And then another key indicator is if you're looking straight down at the stalk, it appears to pierce right through the leaves. See there? Very interesting growth pattern. Now, the flowers on this, as the name says, are absolutely tiny. They're very close to bursting, and you know what? I have a feeling they're going to be in full bloom on the summer solstice, which is just the greatest feeling. And that's kind of what they're notorious for doing. Actually, they're called St. John's wort because St. John's Day is around the summer solstice. So I think it's going to happen, and I'm very excited. They're all over the place. And this is one of those things, like, there's a few other plants that are really showing up for us this year, and that is the first one we noticed was elderflower. We noticed it right around when the pandemic started. We have also never had an elderflower bush on our property, and suddenly we found all these first year elder leaves popping up all throughout the woods. It was crazy, and they're not going to bloom for us this year since their first year, but we used a lot of the leaves in our medicinal preparations for COVID, and it just was wild to see them for the first time. Another one that did that for us, and I know I've talked to you all a lot about pussy toes, everlasting pussy toes, but I had never seen Pennsylvania everlasting in this region before until this year. So this is another one that really popped up and was like, hey, I'm here for you. And then, of course, St. John's wort. So exciting. Okay, so let's get to the medicinal properties of this plant. So, as I mentioned before, the medicinal properties of this plant are within the blooms, the yellow blooms. That's where the blood is. There are varieties of St. John's wort that do not contain the hypericin at all. We actually have quite a few of those around here. And that doesn't mean that they're not medicinal. They just have different medicinal properties, and you actually use the leaves of them for external things like wounds and whatnot. So next time I see one of those, I'll do a little report on here for you guys on that one. But specifically the ones that we're after are the ones that have the hypericin content. And now what that's going to do for us is a few things. It has both internal and external uses. Internally, you've likely heard of it being used for depression. The cool thing about using St. John's wort for depression is that it's not just like a sedative nervine that's going to nourish, replenish a frayed nervous system and help to chill you out. It's actually working to retrain neuropathways to help sort of reconstruct your brain and relieve some depression. So it's really good for long-term depression, people who experience it regularly. Now, there's a few issues with it as well. It has a lot of contraindications, and for that reason, if you're on any sort of antidepressant, you likely cannot use St. John's wort. If you are looking to not be on antidepressants, you could absolutely give this plant a try. What I use it for is its topical uses and its pain relieving uses internally. It is in our Nerve Swerve blend, which is a blend made for neuropathy pain, nerve pain of all kinds, and that's what we use it for externally as well. It is an incredible pain reliever for specific nerve pain, sciatica, all that real deep stuff. So this is in our CBD muscle rub, and I also make a Nerve Swerve oil for topical use that has this in it as well. Now, if you don't have this plant growing near you and you want to try St. John's wort oil or tincture, make sure when you are buying it online that it's blood red. The tincture and the oil should be blood red. When all of these are blooming and I go to make an oil infusion, I will do a video for you all because it's a little tricky. And if you haven't watched our first DIY fresh herb infused oil video, go way back and watch it because it's pretty tricky making fresh herb infused oils. It's not just as simple as pouring the oil over it, because we know when we have fresh herbs we have water content, and water plus oil plus oxygen equals mold. So you have to be very careful. Another interesting thing about that is that these are only going to be in bloom for a short period of time. So just like the milky oats, where we had to harvest as much as we could during the 10 days that they were milky and do things to preserve them fresh so we could use them all year, we're going to have to do the same thing with St. John's wort, which means making a ton of oil and tincture to last you a year, or potentially freezing some, or potentially doing the preservation technique I did a video on a bit back, where we might blend this up with a small amount of alcohol, just enough to blend it and keep it in a bag in the freezer. So that's St. John's wort. I cannot wait for it to bloom on the solstice. I'm probably going to cry. Now, I know in the last video I did some talking about Pennsylvania everlasting, but it's pretty cool to see it in bloom. Some might look at these blooms and think that they were on their way out. They look pretty dried, but that is how the everlasting family of flowers looks. They're called paper flowers because they're very dry and papery. They're used a lot in bouquets, especially pearly everlasting. Hey, get out of there. Olin is notorious for walking straight through my plant piles. Paper flowers and pearly everlasting are commonly used in bouquets because they look just as fresh when you've picked them as they did when they were growing. Pretty cool. Now, while I'm right here, we can go ahead and say hello to some nettle that I transplanted that's doing pretty good. And, oh, I've got some mountain mint coming up too. Okay, so this here is Canadian wood nettle. People seem to be a lot less familiar with Canadian wood nettle than they do common stinging nettle, and I'm not sure why, but in our region here, this is way more prevalent than stinging nettle. So you can see it's got much bigger, wider leaves. It's got these very prominent teeth on the edge of it. And then if we flip it over, well, these ones are pretty young, so I don't see many hairs. Hello? Well, I'm not going to be able to show you a good example, but they're pretty hairy, typically, and that's where they sting. It does take a little while for those hairs to develop on the Canadian wood nettle, so right now, for example, I'm brushing my hands through it, and it just barely tingles. It's not a sharp sting. I've also found the smaller the nettle, the bigger the sting. So common stinging nettle is much, much smaller and has a really sharp sting. These you can totally brush your hands across and you're not going to get that sting that lasts all day like with other nettle. Look at this guy. Ridiculous. But I really love this nettle because it shows up so much for us everywhere. It loves to grow by water, and we live right by the Harpeth River. So there are actually parts of the river where the nettle is growing taller than us on either side of the path. Super cool. So I'm sure most of you know a bit about nettle at this point. I consider nettle to be a multivitamin herb, more so than something I take for its actions. Now, to give you an example of what I mean by that, we would use St. John's wort, goldenrod, bone set. Most herbs we're taking because we need what they offer us. They're astringent, antiseptic, antibacterial, antiviral, whereas nettle, although it does have some antihistamine properties, I just lost my track. It offers so much more in the context of vitamins and minerals. It's incredibly vitamin and mineral rich. I do use it occasionally for allergies, although I have found it can be too stimulating for some people's allergies. So you have to just watch it closely if you're planning on using it for that. What we do way more often is we keep vinegar, apple cider vinegar on our counter, and we load it up with fresh nettles, horsetail, maybe some shiso, basil, holy basil, any of those like green pungent flavor plants that we can incorporate into an apple cider vinegar to make an oxymel, to use in a hair rinse, to use as a salad dressing, to put in bone broth, all sorts of things. So we just kind of keep it going all the time. And I have found nettle to be more useful in that way because it's helping us to incorporate vitamins and minerals that have not been tampered with that we can add directly into our food. You can also cook nettles, and that's another favorite way I like to use them. Oh, the chickens are coming. To get all those vitamins and minerals as well. Of course, when you're ingesting a whole plant versus just extracting it and then taking the liquid that you've extracted it into, you're going to get a few more things from that plant, especially, I have to show you the girls, especially in the context of minerals. Hello, ladies. So think about really dark leafy greens like kale and whatnot. Tippy. Tip, tip. Nettle is going to be very similar to those with what it has to offer us, so eating it is incredible. Nettle is an interesting one to eat. You really want to cook those stinging hairs off of it. You also just want to blanch it flavor-wise too. So if you have access to nettle all the time, then you could just go out and snip it when you're ready, blanch it, and use it however you like. We make a nettle gnocchi pretty regularly that's really good. Sometimes Francesco will blend it up in his sausage. But some other things you can do if it doesn't grow near you, and you only have a chance to harvest it every now and then. I saw someone recently dried a lot of it and powdered it, and then they just used that powder to add to smoothies, teas, foods, whatever. The flavor is not super strong, so if you're drying and powdering it, it's gonna be pretty good in whatever you put it in, pretty mild. And then another thing people will do is blanch it and freeze it. So then you can just pull it out when you're ready to incorporate it into foods. So let's take a pit stop here at Mountain Mint. I really like to show people Mountain Mint in its final form because it changes the way it looks so drastically, and you are likely to notice it when it's mature more so than when it's young like this. So this is a young Mountain Mint plant. So very green leaves. We don't see that ashy color that we see when it matures just yet. It does have the classic mint pattern, the opposite leaves, and a square stem. And the best way, of course, to identify it would be to pinch a leaf off and take a whiff, because, oh, this is one of my favorite scents. This mint is so different in flavor than your classic garden mint or spearmint or apple mint or anything. And the best way to describe it is you can kind of see the ashy color on the underside. When you see mountain mint matured, it looks like someone came through and blew baby powder dust all over it. It has the most beautiful ashy white gray sheen you've ever seen. And it gets really hard. It's super interesting. It's almost as though the plant is dried on the stalk. And the best way to describe it is that it almost has an ashy flavor, like an icy, cool, ashy flavor and scent, almost sage-like. The first time I smelled mountain mint, I was instantly receiving a message that I needed to burn it to purify air in my home, and it just smells so good. It's very sage-like. I would not doubt if they shared some components. So we use this exactly how you would use any other kind of mint. We just use it a lot more often because it's delicious, and I want to say by the age of 16 I was just a little burnt out on peppermint. But this is just such a different flavor. When people try our teas that has this mint in it instead of garden mint or peppermint, people are blown away. They're like, what is that flavor? I can't put my finger on it. It's the mountain mint. We use mountain mint honey in quite a few of our tinctures. It's in our lung mend because it's got some wonderful expectorant properties and qualities about it. It's got an affinity for the lungs and the small air passages, throats, coughs, all kinds of respiratory stuff. It is often called wild horehound and is compared to horehound a lot. And horehound, though in the mint family, has slightly different medicinal qualities than classic mint too. So this is going to be more comparable to horehound than it is mint. Let me try to show you an up close of the growth pattern here. Again, it's a little harder to identify at this stage. It's a lot easier to identify in the fall when it's fully matured. And honestly, this is one of those that we harvest year round. And it's one of our favorites. You can, of course, make teas with this, utilize it in foods, how you would use other kinds of mint or horehound. I want to make a medicinal throat lozenge from this mint so bad. I also think it would be really nice to make mountain mint marshmallow root marshmallows to deliver those good mucilaginous expectorant properties during a cold. So maybe in the fall I'll experiment with some recipes for you all. But until then, we are using this in all sorts of summer preparations to keep us cool.